Nakita naman ikaw.
Your use, but otherwise, um, please don't reproduce the images outside of the recording. Uh, so emerald gemology. So we're going to cover the physical properties of emeralds, inclusions, and inclusions let us determine if emeralds are natural, treated, or synthetic. Talk about some advanced testing, including Raman spectroscopy, infrared spectroscopy, UV, vis, near infrared spectroscopy, and also trace element chemistry analysis by laser ablation, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. So as a gemologist, this is sort of the workflow that we have in the laboratory. And so the first step is to, when you have a green stone, you want to determine whether or not it is or is not an emerald. And so we have some basic optical tests that we use to confirm that. So we measure the optical properties. So that would be things like the refractive index, the specific gravity, the visible spectrum. And these physical properties are unique to emerald. And so we can identify if we have an emerald material in that way. However, those tests don't really let us know if we might have a treated emerald or a synthetic emerald. And so we then go to the microscope and we look at inclusions that may be diagnostic or tell us if the emerald is natural origin or has been produced in a laboratory. And as long as there's inclusions present, that's a useful method. If inclusions aren't present and the stone's particularly clean or free of inclusions, then we may have to go to additional testing such as an infrared spectrum or trace element chemistry analysis. And those are other methods that we can use to separate natural and synthetic emeralds. We also look for treatments, and the main treatment that we're looking for with regard to emeralds is clarity enhancement. So the geologic conditions that emeralds form in are pretty harsh, and in that way, they often are heavily fractured when they're in the ground. And so when they're cut into a gemstone, the appearance of those fractures sort of impairs the clarity or makes them less transparent than you would really like. And so the way the emeralds are, the clarity is improved is by enhancing them with some sort of clarity enhancing residue like oil or epoxy resin. And, and if there's, those materials basically match the refractive index of the host emerald so that light passes through the stone unobstructed, and it improves the clarity by quite a significant degree. And so we look for the fractures that exist in the stone and try to determine if those fractures have been filled with a residue which would improve the clarity. So that determination is done in the microscope. And then the last consideration that we may have in the laboratory for emeralds is the geographic origin determination. As I'm sure you all are aware, there's a premium on emeralds as a general rule from Colombia. Colombia is, really the benchmark of quality standard for emeralds in the gem trade, and so Colombian emeralds generally carry a premium because of that fact. And a lot of clients really want to know where their emerald comes from. There's a lot of deposits globally, and there's some differences in the appearance of those stones. There's Colombia, Zambia, Brazil, Russia, and so we look um, at the details of the stone, the trace element chemistry, and the inclusions, and we try to work backwards from the information we can gather in order to determine where a gemstone may have come from. So the physical properties in the gemological laboratory, this is really one of the main starting points. We look at the refractive index and basically confirm that we have a refractive index that's consistent with the mineral beryl. Beryl, of course, is the mineral name for emerald, emerald just being the green variety that's colored by chromium or vanadium. So we measure the refractive index, and we'd expect to get a refractive index measurement of around 1.57 to 1.58. And we also measure the birefringence, which should be around 0.007. As long as that property matches, then we're well on our way to confirming we have an emerald and not an imitation stone like a piece of glass or plastic or quartz or something else that's not a beryl. We also measure the specific gravity, and we can do this hydrostatically using a scale with the appropriate hardware for making a hydrostatic measurement. And so the specific gravity for beryl is around 2.7. So we also have to confirm that the specific gravity is consistent with beryl. And this would eliminate things like glass and plastic or green materials that could be an imitation of beryl. We also look at the spectroscope. And so using a handheld spectroscope like this, we're looking at the absorption spectrum. And so when emeralds absorb light, they do it in a characteristic way. And what basically everything that's left over is green light. There's also a little bit of red, but you have this strong absorption window here in the blue region, and also in the sort of orange to red region here. And you have this large transmission window in the green region, and that's where the green color comes from in emerald when you have chromium vanadium trapped in the crystal lattice. And so we look at this this visible spectrum using this small prism type spectroscope to confirm that we have a beryl that is specifically colored by chromium and vanadium. If we had a beryl but the spectrum didn't match, it could be that the stone was dyed with an organic green compound or something like that. And then we wouldn't have an emerald, we would have a dyed beryl, which does occasionally happen in the gem trade. The next thing that we look for is inclusions, and inclusions give us a lot of information about the stone. The limitation with the inclusion observation is really the microscopist and the microscopist's experience. So as long as you have some sort of reference and know what kind of features you're looking for, the microscope is a really powerful tool to help you determine if you have a natural stone or if you have a treated stone. And it also is useful to identify inclusions that can help you with determining the geographic origin. I think this slide's a little bit out of order, but for some inclusions, when we have solid mineral inclusions, we can identify those mineral inclusions with a technique called Raman spectroscopy. And that's basically, we have a Raman spectrometer that's mated to a microscope here. And then we basically shoot a laser beam of a known wavelength. It travels through this mirror component and through the microscope objective lens, and it bounces off the sample. And then the laser light gets scattered off of the sample and travels back through the optical path to a detector where we measure the Raman shift. And that Raman shift, or the Raman scatter, is like a fingerprint for gem minerals. And so if we use the microscope to target an inclusion inside the stone, we can collect that Raman spectrum on the inclusion to identify what that mineral inside of the emerald might be. So that can help us to determine if we have something like a calcite or a mica crystal, or even something like a phenakite, which would tell us we might have a synthetic emerald. When we're looking at emeralds, there's two main groups that we are trying to sort these emeralds into to help us make a determination for origin. And these are two examples. We have an example of a Colombian emerald. And so that's from a hydrothermal type of environment. And then the other type of environment is what we'd call a schist hosted environment. And this example on the right here is from Ethiopia. And you can see some of the biotite schist on the outside of the emerald crystal. And with the Colombian hydrothermal example here, you have some black shale here with some carbonate minerals and things like that that represent this growth environment. So those are the two major groups that we're trying to classify emeralds into to help narrow down the potential geographic origin that an unknown emerald stone may be derived from. So we look at inclusions, and this is what we would call a jagged three-phase fluid inclusion, and it can and the contents of this fluid inclusion are solid, these little blocky square inclusions. These are halite typically, sometimes sylvite, but a salt crystal. You have a vapor bubble here. Typically that could be carbon dioxide. And then you have aqueous brine, which is the filling material around the bubble. And these jagged shaped fluid inclusions were historically thought to be diagnostic for Colombian origin, but as more emerald deposits were discovered along the way, we started to see a significant overlap in this type of fluid inclusion. And so it's no longer necessarily diagnostic for Colombian origin, but it's certainly what I would call a pretty strong indicator. But you can have similar inclusions in emeralds from places like China and Afghanistan. Colombian emeralds also contain solid mineral inclusions such as this pyrite. So you have pyrite, there's within the genetic conditions that these emeralds form in Colombia, pyrite's significant because the pyrite is responsible for basically pulling all of the iron out of the nutrient solution that the emeralds form in. And when you have emeralds that are low in iron, they tend to have a better color and more of a vibrant color, whereas high iron emeralds from schist-hosted deposits tend to be a little more on the darkish side and not quite as vibrant as you would expect. And so the pyrite, because the pyrite exists, it basically modified the nutrient solution and removed all of the available iron just so it can exist. And so Colombian emeralds, one of the hallmark characteristics and quality factors about these stones is that they're very low iron, and we owe that low iron to the existence of the pyrite. In Colombian emeralds, we often, well, I wouldn't say often, but we do occasionally see this type of growth structure. And this is what we refer to as Goto de escate. You all probably know that this means a drop of oil, or it has this sort of roiled or turbulent look about it. And we see this in areas in Colombian emeralds where there's rapid columnar type of growth. And so what you see here, these sort of prismatic structures, are when we're looking down the optic axis of the emerald crystal, and these little structures here represent changes in the trace element chemistry of the nutrient solution. And so you probably have multiple stages of growth. So you have these little columnar sectors, and then you have a second stage of growth where maybe perhaps the chromium and iron, or the chromium vanadium was depleted a bit, and so you've modified the refractive index in these intermediate areas. And so this Goto de escate effect tends to occur parallel to the basal pinacoid of the emerald crystal, and typically in these sort of thin bands, and you may have several of these sort of Goto de escate layers in a single emerald crystal, which just sort of indicate these sort of rapid growth periods within the development of that emerald crystal. Here's another example where you have this same kind of effect. And so you can sort of see this sort of hexagonal outline, which is consistent with the hexagonal crystal system of the emerald host. And then so you have these rapid development in these thin layers, and then these sort of intermediate areas where you have a difference in the refractive index. And so this is most commonly seen in Colombian stones, but it has a similar effect has been seen in stones from Zambia. But for the most part, this is highly indicative that you have a Colombian origin stone. You also have quite regularly, you have calcite or carbonate crystals in Colombian emeralds. And in polarized light, these stand out with high relief due to the interference colors that you see. So this is observed in the microscope using cross-polarized light. You have a lot of calcite and carbonates present in the growth environment, and so it certainly makes sense that you would have carbonate inclusions present in the emerald as well. These are fluid inclusions that are from a similar type of environment to Columbian stones. This is emeralds from North Carolina in Alexander County, and they form in a similar environment where you have these hydrothermal veins that contain a lot of carbonates and quartzes and mica, but you have these fluid inclusions throughout, similar to what you would get in a Columbian stone, but they tend to be more rounded in shape and not quite so jagged. In North Carolina stones, you also have rutile inclusions, which is a bit unique. Another type of the schist-hosted deposits, you get inclusions that represent the growth environment, which is in strong contrast to the hydrothermal material. And so we tend to see things like this mica crystals. So this is a biotite mica, and that's what we would expect to see because of the emeralds growing in a biotite schist. Here's another example of biotite in an emerald. These dark brown crystals here just below the surface of this crystal. This is an unpolished prism face, and this is an emerald from Ethiopia with some biotite mica inclusions. As far as the schist-hosted emeralds go, this is probably the most common type of inclusion, at least solid mineral inclusion that you'll see. In schist-hosted emeralds, you often tend to get what we call these blocky fluid inclusions. So these are primary fluid inclusions, which means that the fluids are trapped during growth. And so these little samples of the fluid that is present while the emerald's growing is trapped as a homogeneous fluid, but then as the emeralds cool down, there's an unmixing that occurs, and so you tend to get separation into the component parts, which typically produces daughter crystals like what you see here, and these little sort of lath-like, needle-like inclusions. There's usually a contraction bubble, probably carbon dioxide, and then a water component. So these things are typically pretty complex, typically three-phase inclusions, but you may only see two phases. The solids are sometimes very difficult to see, but this is a pretty typical type of inclusion that you would get in these schist-hosted deposits. In the schist-hosted emeralds, because they're high iron as a general rule, they usually result, along the contact of a pegmatite body that intrudes into ultramafic rock. And so there's a lot of iron present, and that's where the contact metamorphism produces the biotite schist. And because there's a lot of iron available in the growth environment, you have inclusions that are high in iron. And so what we often see are these exsolution products that are these skeletal ilmenite or hematite inclusions that are aligned parallel to the basal plane. And so you'll get these kinds of inclusions in a high iron stone. And since they're present in a high iron stone, you're not going to see these kinds of inclusions in, say, a Columbian emerald, because there's just not enough iron available during growth for these types of inclusions to exist. And so these inclusions can really give us a clue that we have an emerald from a schist-hosted deposit, and not only that, but from a high iron schist-hosted deposit. Russian stones tend to be a bit lower in iron, even though they're schist-hosted emeralds. And so you typically don't have enough iron to see these kinds of inclusions present in a Russian stone. You also see things like Emphibole needles in schist-hosted deposits. And so these elongated mineral inclusions, you could get this type of inclusion in stones from, say, Russia or Zambia. You also have stones that have Tremolite needles that can be quite dense, and these sort of elongated prismatic inclusions. These are typically what you'd expect to see in a Zimbabwe stone. And those stones are generally quite small, but usually have a very strong saturated green color. You also have occasionally diagnostic inclusions, and in the case of Russian emeralds, you have these really colorful iridescent fluid inclusions that are oriented parallel to the basal plane. And when we see these types of inclusions, that's a strong indicator that we have a stone from Russia. Okay, so now we're going to look at a few examples of treatment in the microscope. And again, most of the treatment is really centered around clarity enhancement or minimizing the appearance of fractures in the emerald. And so the most recognizable way that we detect clarity enhancement, either by oils or resin, is by what we call flash effect. So when we're looking nearly parallel to the fracture plane, what we'll often see are these flash effect colors, which in dark field, the flash effect colors are orange, and in bright field, the flash effect colors are blue. And so as we rock and tilt the stone, these flash effect colors may switch between orange and blue. But even though we can see clearly in this example, the flash effect colors, the fractures are really nearly invisible. And that's because there's a clarity enhancing residue in these fractures. We also look for things like trapped gas bubbles. And so when we have these kind of rounded shapes that are combined within this sort of two-dimensional surface, that tells us that we have sort of a clarity enhancing material trapped within a fracture plane. And let's see. And so here's another example of clarity enhancement. So this was a large void that was a fluid inclusion, and it reached the surface. And so the clarity enhancing resin entered into this larger cavity, and it was wide enough so that you could see the sort of brownish color of the oil or resin. I see we've got a question or two coming in here. I just wanted to see if it's something we need to address. So there's a question in here that the treatment in gems of other localities can generate three-phase jagged-like inclusions that can falsify the origin, confusing them with Colombian emeralds. If I understand correctly, yes, the three-phase fluid inclusions from origins that are not Colombia can look very similar. So if you rely only on the fluid inclusions, it's possible to mistakenly identify an emerald as Colombian based on the fluid inclusions alone. And so in that way, we have to rely on the inclusions and the trace element chemistry to make sure that when we issue an origin for a Colombian emerald, that it is from Colombia. Certainly the biggest overlap and probably the most confusing deposit is stones from Afghanistan. In the microscope, those can very much look like Colombian. And so that's where the trace element chemistry, which we'll talk about in a little bit, will come into play. And then the second part of this question, is it possible that synthetic emeralds will have identical three-phase inclusions? And the short answer there is no, they will not. You can have flux inclusions, which I'll show in just a minute, but the inclusions in synthetics in that regard will not really look anything like fluid inclusions in a natural stone. So yeah, feel free. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat if questions come up as we go along. And then of course we can go over any more questions at the end if anyone has any. So here's another example of clarity enhancement. And this is what we would call partial filling. And so a lot of times the clarity enhancing residue might start to break down or decompose or even dry up. And so you have basically shrinkage cracks that form within the fracture plane of the filler. And so in this case, using reflected light, we have these vibrant, colorful areas, and that's where we get thin film interference effects from the high refractive index difference between the emerald host and the air that's trapped here. But in these low relief areas that are the sort of dendritic pattern within this fracture plane, that's where there's still some clarity enhancing residue present. And so what someone would typically do would be to clean this fracture out and then refill it. But there's still some partial clarity enhancing that's happening within this stone. And then another good way to check for clarity enhancement is looking at the surface of the stone. And here we're looking at the stone in reflected light. And so we see this fracture that breaks the surface. And using sort of a hot point and just sort of getting that hot point close to the surface of the stone, it'll create thermal expansion in the oil, and the oil will actually start to bead up along the surface where the fracture is exposed. And you'll have these drops of oil. And that's how you can, another way that you can confirm visually that you have clarity enhancing in your emerald. Okay, let's go over a few synthetics here. The first type of synthetic is a hydrothermal synthetic. And so these stones are grown in an autoclave on a seed plate. So they typically would have either a natural barrel or a synthetic barrel seed plate that could be colorless. And then they hang those seed plates on typically a platinum wire and put it in an autoclave with aqueous solution and all the nutrient material to grow emeralds, so beryllium and aluminum and things like that. And then also the chromophore, so you need chromium and or vanadium. And then they grow these crystals on the seed plate. But what you get is this sort of unnatural looking growth pattern, which we sometimes call chevron graining. And this is really a hallmark identifier for a hydrothermal synthetic emerald product. So in the microscope, if you see this, this is going to be diagnostic of a synthetic stone. And it's not something that you would really ever find in a natural stone. Here's another example of a synthetic stone, but this particular one is a fingerprint type of inclusion of flux. And so what you see here are all of this whole surface in the middle. This was a fracture, and when the stone fractured during growth, the flux residue entered into the fracture and helped to facilitate this sort of repair of the fracture. And what happens is that as the emerald starts to repair, it traps these little low energy negative crystals of flux residue. And so they tend to, in this case, they have this sort of brownish look. And what you'll notice is that each one of these little negative crystals has a little tiny minute contraction bubble, but otherwise the only component in there is this flux. So there's no daughter crystals, there's no third solid phase in there. And so these are flux inclusions in a flux-grown synthetic emerald. And in this case, the inclusions are certainly enough to identify this as a flux-grown stone. But if there aren't any flux inclusions in the stone, then you certainly can't rely on that as a diagnostic tool to make a determination for the natural or synthetic origin. But fortunately for flux-grown stones, you can make the separation quite easily using infrared spectroscopy, which I'll show a little bit later on. Here's another common type feature in hydrothermal synthetic emeralds, and these are what we call nailhead spicules. And basically you have inclusions that are precipitating out of the growth solution that are not emerald. Typically it would be something like phenakite. And those phenakite inclusions act as a growth blockage. So if you have growth in the direction of this image, it would be from the top to the bottom. You would have an inclusion that would block the growth of the emerald, and it would create this trapping mechanism. And so these growth blockages, they're these tube-like structures that trap nutrient fluid behind the growth, behind the block inclusion, typically the phenakite. And so they create these hollow tubes, and then as growth continues on, it tends to taper as the growth is inward. And so you have much more rapid growth along the C-axis than you do in the A-axis. And so eventually these these will seal up, but you tend to form these sort of tapered spicules, or these nailhead spicules. And so this is indicative, quite strongly indicative of synthetic origin. However, because it's just a trapping mechanism, you can occasionally have a similar feature in natural stones, but when you have this large amount of them like you see in this photo, that's quite strongly indicative of synthetic origin. These are phenakite inclusions in a Chatham flux synthetic emerald. Phenakite is generally a pegmatitic mineral, and since emeralds don't really grow in a pegmatite as a general rule, that's an inclusion that you wouldn't really expect to get in a natural emerald. So whenever you have phenakite inclusions in your emerald, especially in the quantity that you see in this stone, that's a pretty strong indicator that you have a flux grown synthetic. And again, you can, if these inclusions weren't present, then we could rely on other testing like infrared spectroscopy to make that determination. Here's another example of flux residue within a synthetic emerald. So this particular one is a Gilson product, and so you have this whitish flux residue. And if you look here, you have this contraction bubble here. And so there's no complex fluid inclusion going on here. There's no daughter crystals. You only have the whitish flux residue and a contraction bubble. And a lot of times in emeralds, when you have bubble-like features, it may move around within the cavity. But when you have flux, these contraction bubbles, they're basically frozen in place. So as you rock and tilt the stone, these contraction bubbles are not able to move around, which may give you another clue that you have flux and not an aqueous fluid. Okay. So infrared spectroscopy, as I mentioned earlier, when inclusions aren't sufficient enough to make a determination about the natural or synthetic origin of a emerald, we can often look to infrared spectroscopy to help make that determination. So this is what a typical infrared spectrometer would look like. You have your infrared beam that travels through here and goes through this mirror array, and then it bounces off of your mirrors and then through your sample here, which is this purple stone, and then to the detector over here. And so then we measure the absorption spectrum in the infrared region, and we can gather some important information about that spectrum. And so if you look at the blue trace here, this is the characteristic spectrum of a natural emerald. These large features here are related to water primarily. And so since emeralds are, they form in aqueous types of environments, there's a lot of water present. And then if you look at this flux grown spectrum, you'll notice that these big tall water features are not present. And so that's diagnostic of flux origin. And then another specific type of hydrothermal synthetic where infrared spectroscopy is useful is from a manufacturer called Byron. So these Byron hydrothermal synthetics, they tend to show these additional features here in this sort of 3,000 to 2,500 wave number range. And that can be indicative that you have a Byron hydrothermal synthetic. So UV vis spectroscopy. We use this type of spectroscopy to basically help make determinations quickly if we have high iron or low iron emeralds, and also to confirm that the color that we see is related to chromium and vanadium. And so we have the spectrometer here, which is just sort of this sort of generic looking gray box. It's connected to a computer. We put the sample into the beam path and we measure the absorption spectrum. And this is the type of spectra that we get. On the left here, these are low iron samples that you would get from a hydrothermal type deposit. Most Colombian stones are going to look like this bottom trace, this green trace down here. And so the features at around 400 and 600, these are the absorption bands that we're getting from chromium and vanadium, and that's what's responsible for the green color. So that these two bands produce this large transmission window centered at around 500, which is where green color is, and that's why your emeralds are green. But if we look further out into the near infrared region, iron will contribute some absorption here, and the more iron you have, you'll get this larger broadband absorption centered around 810 nanometers. And so when we have just a little bit of iron, that tells us that we have a stone from a hydrothermal type of deposit. And then if you look at the trace on the series of traces on the right here, you'll notice that that 810 nanometer band relative to the chromium bands is quite large. And so these strong absorption here tells us that we have schist hosted types of emeralds. Okay, and then after gathering that information, if we still need more information to unravel the geographic origin or to determine if we have a natural synthetic stone, we can rely on trace element chemistry. And so to measure trace element chemistry in our laboratory, we have a LAIC PMS unit, and that's laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectroscopy. So this black box here, this is the laser ablation unit. And so we put our samples in the sample chamber and use a laser to ablate a very small portion of that stone. And the ablation spot size is about 55 microns or so. And then there's a carrier gas that takes that ionized ablated material and carries it over here to the detector as it travels through a plasma torch. And then we basically measure the concentration of ions that is ablated from the host material. And so that can measure the bulk composition of the stone and also the trace elements. And then when we look at that data, we can plot that data against reference data from known samples that we've collected in the field. So at GIA, we have a field gemology program where we send geologists out to different mines all over the world, and they collect samples in the mine so that we know we have a reliable reference data set. And so we bring those samples back to the mine or back to the lab, and we measure the trace element chemistry for all these different locations and put into a database. And then when we get an unknown stone, we can compare that trace element chemistry to our database of known samples. And when we can match the chemistry profiles, that can tell us if we have a stone from a specific origin. And so all these dots that you see on these on this trace element chemistry maps, these are dots that represent populations from different origins. And so if our unknown sample falls squarely into these green dots, that would tell us that we have a Colombian stone. Or if our unknown sample was to fall in these dark blue dots, that would mean that we have a Russian stone for our unknown sample. So that's how we use the trace element chemistry to help make an origin determination. And of course, we pair that with our inclusions. And as long as the inclusions agree with our trace element chemistry, then we have a high confidence that we have the correct origin. Okay, and so that's basically the story of the gemology of emeralds. And so there's a few additional resources I'd just like to introduce you to. So a lot of the images that you've seen in this presentation today, they can be found on the GIA website. That's at www.gia.edu. We produced this micro features of emerald chart, and so that should be available. If you go to the website and search for the micro features of emerald, you should be able to pull that up. And so it's a lot of photomicrographs showing features from a wide variety of emeralds and treated stones and synthetic stones also. And another important resource, I think, as far as origin goes, is the quarterly journal that GIA produces called Gems in Gemology. And the winter 2019 issue was a special edition on geographic origin specifically. And so in that issue, we covered geographic origin and analytical methods for several gem materials. And specifically, there's an article in there on the geographic origin determination of emerald. And then another resource that I think is a really important paper was written by one of our GIA staff members, the curator of our museum, actually, Terry Ottaway, and that article was in the journal Nature in June 1994, and you should be able to look that up online as well, which gives you a nice story about the geologic conditions of Colombian emeralds. So with that, if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take those. Let's see here. So I have a question here. Which kind of imitations have I encountered? So the main kinds of imitations for emerald are probably green glass, green plastic. There are also very sophisticated imitations where you have colorless beryl, that's a natural colorless beryl, also known as goshenite, and then you've had a synthetic emerald overgrowth deposited over top of the natural colorless beryl. And so in that way, you have inclusions that look like a natural stone, but all of the green color is at the shallow surface layer, and those stones were produced by a company called Leck Leitner. So those were probably the most sophisticated imitations, I suppose, that I've seen of emerald. And then as far as other countries that I've seen pyrite as an inclusion, I think Pakistan has pyrite as an inclusion, if memory serves. And I think you can get in a few of the other deposits, but right away, Pakistan is the Swat Valley emeralds. Those have pyrite occasionally. And then the next question here is, what are the biggest challenges to differentiate authentic emeralds from fake ones? Most of the time, that's not really a very big challenge, but occasionally we have stones that come through that are exceedingly clean, which those are really the most problematic stones. So small stones that don't have a lot of space to have inclusions, so you don't have the visual clues to confirm natural or synthetic origin. We've had stones like that come through, and then we have to rely exclusively on trace element chemistry. And there's some deposits in Nigeria where they have somewhat strange trace element chemistry, and those can be the biggest ones as far as the challenge to separate natural versus synthetic. So emeralds, as a general rule, have a lot of inclusions. So when we get emeralds that are free of inclusions and sometimes stones from Nigeria, those are probably the biggest challenge for that. The next question is, does the host rock type influence the geometry of the inclusions? The short answer is probably not the host rock. The geometry of inclusions is really mostly influenced by the crystal structure of the beryl or the emerald itself. And so when you have fluid inclusions that are trapped within the emerald, over time, the beryl will want to reorganize the crystal lattice in that surrounding area into the lowest energy form. And so that's where you tend to develop inclusions that we call negative crystals. And that's where the fluid inclusion has the shape of the host mineral, but it's a negative space relative to the host material that usually contains fluid or the daughter crystals. And so that the shape of those inclusions is really dictated by the crystallographic arrangement of atoms in the emerald host, and not so much by the rock type of the surrounding area. What type of geological processes are needed to find rutile or pyrite inclusions on the emeralds? So if I understand the question, basically you would need the right kind of geologic environment where those types of minerals are going to exist in the host rock. And so that's going to be cases where you have hydrothermal type deposits as a general rule. So in that way, the geologic conditions are going to influence the types of inclusions as far as the availability of rutile or pyrite. And then the next question here we have, why do Colombian emeralds usually contain triphase inclusions, liquid, gas, and solid? So actually most emeralds contain three-phase fluid inclusions. And so emeralds, as a general rule, they form in environments, and regardless of the environment, either these kinds of hydrothermal types of environments or these sort of schist-hosted metamorphic environments, there's going to be a fluid component involved in either of those types of deposits. And so whenever there's fluid involved, if the fluid is trapped as an inclusion within the stone, when the stone's at the growth temperature and the growth pressure that exists within the earth during the formation, it'll be trapped as a homogeneous liquid. So we call this homogeneous entrapment. And so once we mine those stones and they're now pulled out of the ground and they're no longer at the conditions that they formed in, we've changed the conditions, and so those fluids have modified or adjusted to react to the current conditions. And so basically the change is the temperature. So if you're holding an emerald in your hand, it's no longer at the high temperature, relatively speaking, that emerald formed in. And so that fluid has, when it's at a higher temperature, it can dissolve these kinds of components and these minerals into the fluid. But at a lower temperature, it becomes supersaturated. So you have this unmixing of this homogeneous liquid where it separates out into the component parts. And that's where you have the fluid inclusions that separate out into the three phases, which is typically going to be solid crystal, a CO2 gas, and then whatever's left over as an aqueous brine. Hopefully that helps there. Can we determine the origin of an emerald with FTIR? So the short answer there is, if we're talking about geographic origin, then the answer is going to be no. There's really no significant difference with emeralds of different origins in the infrared spectrum. So for that, you really have to stick with trace element chemistry and inclusions in order to sort of get any information about subtle differences with the geologic environment. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for having me. If there's any other questions later on, you all are more than welcome to email me. My email is renfro@gia.edu, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that way as well.
Okay, if there is no question in chat, thank you, Mr. Nathan Renfro. It has been a pleasure to have you here, and thank you to all our attendees for being here. We hope you have learned a lot about emeralds and their gemological characteristics, and thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, a todos nuestros asistentes, muchas gracias por la participación. Si no hay ninguna pregunta más, damos por terminada esta sesión y muchas gracias a todos.